So I think it's actually really cool that we're talking about this particular TV film this week,
Mm.
and I'll explain why I'm calling it a TV film in a minute. Because this is also the week where we officially and finally, after all of the million of little waiting periods for it, got the updated version of The Little Mermaid with Melissa McCarthy as Ursula and
Mm.
I want to say Holly Berry. I know that's not her name, but I always think of her as Holly Berry playing Ariel, but I'm sure that's not her name.
I can have a look and see what it is in but a moment. But yes, it's an interesting coincidence that we're discussing it this week while that's come out.
Yeah, it's. I mean, obviously, because I'm of a certain age, the little Disney Little Mermaid, the '89 animated film, will always have a very special place in my heart. Um, but it's probably one of the more successful Disney adaptations, both to cartoon and Broadway. So I can
Mm.
easily see where it will be a big success. I've seen nothing but positive reviews of the trailer that have finally appeared for it. And much like this uh, TV film did in '97, I feel like if this goes well, it could have a really positive effect on future adaptations of Disney properties with more multiculturally diverse casts.
Hopefully so, yes. I think there is a great deal underpinning the success or failure of this adaptation of The Little Mermaid. You didn't really get this sense with the other ones, even Beauty and the Beast, with Emma Watson in it. It didn't feel like this was such a crucial point in the remake saga as this is. I wonder whether it's due to the fact that they've done a few remakes recently. They haven't really lived up to expectations like Pinocchio, etc. And this is like the first major one to come out at like post-pandemic.
Yeah,
So, mm.
oh, sorry. Go ahead, finish your thought.
I was just gonna say I do wonder whether going forward any other ones that they would do, they're going to sort of judge to see how Ariel does.
Yeah. And I've heard really good things. I have lots of friends that are much bigger fans of Guillermo del Toro than I am. I'm a fan,
Mm.
but I'm not like, I have some friends that are like super fans of his that go to film premieres just to like hear him talk about his film
Mm.
process. And I do think his films are amazing. I've heard some really great stuff about his version of Pinocchio, and that's not really my favorite, like German fairy tale, so I'm not amped for it. But other people really are. Um, what's interesting in looking at the reception to this version of Little Mermaid versus the 1997 Cinderella, which is what we're
Yeah.
actually going to be talking about today. By the way, you have to say '97 Cinderella. Like, that's how you identify Brandy as Cinderella on the
Mm.
Disney Wikipedia, especially. And so in '97, when this was happening, a lot of hopes and dreams were pegged on this '97 Cinderella. If it failed, it was going to tank TV filmed musicals. And if it was succeeded, which it did succeed, it was going to kick off a whole new kind of uh, kind of reappreciation for this form of the genre, which it didn't do as much as people think. Probably because the follow up to that was Annie, which I think maybe five people saw that version of Annie. But as a wholly unique product, if you've never read the Wikipedia page for the 1997 Cinderella version, and this is after me having done research with Marvel Wikipedia pages, this is easily the longest Wikipedia page I have ever read. It is amazing how comprehensive this Wikipedia page is.
That's interesting. I didn't realize there was so much put at stake for this version of Cinderella. Just a quick aside, the name of the actress playing Ariel in Little Mermaid is Haley Bailey.
Oh, see,
So,
that's why I'm getting Halle Berry because it's so
mm,
phonetically close. But Haley Bailey, I'm gonna remember that. because I like to honor my Ariels as well as I can. So, um, yeah, it's very exciting.
Hmm. We shall have to see whether this version of Eric also inspires so many new fanboys as well.
I
We
think
shall see.
my hope is that they'll do to Eric and give him nuance the same way they did to the prince in this, because this is so one of the fun
Hmm.
facts about this that I've learned is that all of the TV telecasts of Cinderella are a little different. Um, and it's definitely different from the Broadway production. Essentially, when they write Cinderella for TV,
Hmm.
they don't rewrite it like they have the skeleton, but especially this 90s version was significantly different from the 50s one with Julie Andrews, which is one of the first TV musical telecasts in America. And it's pretty different from the Leslie Ann Warren 65 version, which I don't think was a musical but might have been. And so basically, this is not a completely new product. But as far as Rodgers and Hammerstein goes, whenever they do something on TV, especially, it always gets rewritten a little bit.
Hmm.
Yeah.
No, I know what you mean. I think I watched the one with Julie Andrews, um, and it is beat for beat, narratively similar to this version. But at the same time, there's something about this version of Cinderella that just completely captures the eye and the imagination. I wonder whether it's a combination of the visuals, because they went for a very stark visual style in this adaptation,
Yeah.
which at the same, which strangely like feels like it feels very pantomime, yet it doesn't feel too cheap at the same time.
Well, there's a
And
surrealist
yeah.
aspect to it. They actually
Mm,
filmed, I don't know if it's just the interior of the Cinderella house or
mm.
also if it's the palace, but this was filmed on the same lot where they filmed the Munchkin scenes from MGM's Wizard of Oz. And so any scene where
Oh.
you've seen like a yellow wall or yellow brick, that's actually homage to the backlot um, that they're on. So that's one of the first ties to other kind of grand cinematic film MGM style ventures is that specifically knowing this backlot changed how they built the art style of this film. So a little bit, not too much, but a little bit.
Oh, that's amazing. I didn't realize there was such a set reusing there. That's a great little fact that I
Yeah.
think I'm going to remember from that one.
Yeah. What was great too is that this was such a project of passion and love that even though the
Mm.
tabloids tried at the time to say that all these big stars were having like conflicting egos and battles, you can see both in the two documentaries Disney has done with behind the scenes and with interviews with the cast and crew that there was a lot of like harmony on the set. Not to give too many musical puns, but this was the kind of passion product where you can see that the final version of it that we got was clearly not just honoring the source material, but was important to everybody involved. I even this Wikipedia page gives me a sense of the passion of the people doing this. One of my favorite things
Mm.
about this is that we almost got this version of Cinderella that NBC would have done. No, it was so originally, this version of Cinderella was going to have Whitney Houston as Cinderella, and this was going to be much
Oh.
much earlier in the '90s, much earlier in her career. Um, but I think what happened was is she saw Diana Ross in The Wiz and was like, she was a little too old to play Dorothy. I don't feel like I can be the naive, soft ingenue anymore. So I don't think I'm gonna play Cinderella. I can imagine that dialogue happening, and of course, then it had to go through massive rewrites, and it was on hold while they figured out who they wanted Cinderella to be. Casting Brandy was both a bit of a get and something where they were really holding out their necks a little bit
Mm.
because there was one executive apparently in the Disney boardroom that was like, we can't have two African American leads, blah. But Whitney was like, I'm not doing this project without Brandy,
Mm.
which was really cool. And I think the product speaks for itself and how good it is, really.
Mm. Well, it kind of feels like perfect casting. The other major pull to me of this film is the powerful performances by really all of the
Yeah.
major cast, and like all that they bring to it. I mean, well, clearly, it's a toss up between Whoopi or Whitney
Yeah.
stealing the show. It's hard
And,
to decide
and
which one.
And unlike something like the Amazon Prime Cinderella they did with Camila Cabello, where it's very
Mm,
auto-tuned and it's just not very, it wasn't very well received. None of this was stunt
mm,
casting. Jason Alexander was very popular at the time for Seinfeld, but before he'd been on Seinfeld, he had been a trained comedic Broadway actor. Like we don't think of Matthew Broderick doing things like Torch Song Trilogy on Broadway, but before
mm,
Matthew Broderick made the leap to film, he was a Broadway actor. So even casting Jason Alexander and Vienna Cox and Natalie Desselle, and Vienna had just come off of a tour of Company, I guess.
mm,
So nobody here was cast just for the star power. They were cast because of their ability. Um, and I think it shows because the level of professionalism that just the amount of professionalism in this cast. My favorite diva moment in this film is the story that is told about Whoopi Goldberg calling up Harry Winston, her personal friend, to get jewels for the queen because she didn't want to wear costume jewelry. So she has the most expensive outfits on set because she wanted to wear real jewelry. They had like three bodyguards
mm.
from Harry Winston. That is one of my. I think that's the only real big diva thing of this, and I think that's so fitting. And also, it was a pleasant surprise that Whoopi could sing because it's a
Mm.
pretty famous thing that when she filmed Sister Act much earlier in the 90s, she lied to them and claimed she couldn't sing. Uh, so I think it's a delight to all to find out that it's not that she can't sing, it's just that she's kind of a low alto, and that's okay.
Mm. When was Sister Act again? 1992, 1993. So that was a good few years actually before this out in 1997. I would have thought that was the other way around, but
No,
no.
she famously is like, I lied to them and I really couldn't sing, and I'm not dubbed, but I wasn't very sure of myself in Sister Act. But it's such an iconic role, and one day we're going to talk about Sister Act, but that's for
Oh
another thing
yes.
completely. Um, yeah.
With the jewelry thing, would you really say that is a diva act, or is that just dedication to bringing some authenticity with the costume to the role?
I think it can be both because the diva's not necessarily a bad thing. They just know what
Oh
they
no.
want. And I think it
Mm,
works really well too, because the costume fits in so well. The costumes in this movie um were so thoughtfully done. The chaos of the stepsisters and the stepmom are so well thought out versus the muted tones of Cinderella's palette. The blue and white of Cinderella's ball gown dress is very well thought out. The almost all of the scenes with royalty feature them in some form of blue or purple, which is supposed to be the
mm,
royalty color. And so that whole palette does not clash with kind of the not quite saccharine, but very technicolor background set. It actually kind of reinforces this idea of this world as fantasy. And I think it works very well. You can see it. In fact, all of the women at the ball have some form of blue dress on. If you
mm,
have watched that scene, they're all in some form, somewhere between aqua and like a blue purple. And even that was meant to show how Cinderella would fit in, about the idea of Cinderella as a dreamer and a lover and someone that could waltz and just didn't have the opportunity. And so like there's so much thought even into the costumes of the dancing extras that is really nice.
mm. And we haven't even discussed one of the most iconic outfits of the entire movie yet. Whitney's fantastic piece. It's
Yes.
quite unlike any other fairy godmother we've seen, is it?
It's true. And so the first fairy godmother in the 1950 telecast was a very famous Broadway actress whose name I'm blanking on. Her first name was Kay. She was known as essentially a comedic actress. So
Hmm.
um, most times when someone plays the fairy godmother in Cinderella, they go into like that kind of mystical maternal headspace, and that wasn't what Whitney wanted for this. She wanted to be more of an actual like godmother character.
Mm.
And I know with her specific costuming, she wanted it to be a little more at. So there's a couple. So I'm pulling this from my memory. This isn't on the Wikipedia page, but during I either it was the 2022 anniversary documentary or the earlier documentary that came with earlier showings of the film, she talked about how she wanted it to be not urban, maybe more African. She used a very specific term in how she wanted the godmother to be dressed. That was very iconic. And I cannot remember what it is for the life of me. If you haven't gotten a chance to watch the 2022 documentary they did, very comprehensive, so it's probably in there. Um, but this was a specific way that she wanted to dress that made sense with what she did. And it's a fabulous costume. Um,
Mm.
by the way, it's definitely part of the iconography of this. I've never seen anyone actually um, do this as like a cosplay costume, which is kind of interesting. I don't think I've ever seen
That's
this version of
true.
Cinderella done as cosplay. I've never even seen a Disney wedding because Disney always likes to do wedding episodes on Disney Plus now for fairy tale
Mm.
weddings. I've never seen anyone do this version of Cinderella as a wedding outfit, and you could easily do the tuxedos and the Cinderella wedding dress pretty easily. I think it would cost some money, but if you're paying to be at Disney, you're already paying like 50 grand for a wedding. You might as well throw a couple more bucks in there for the tuxes.
Mm. Oh, you could definitely imagine like the registrar or the pastor or something dressing up as the fairy godmother to officiate the wedding just because it's such a great outfit. No, I don't. No, that's really true. I mean, this is an iconic film. Like, there's a reason why me and my partner always put this on every Christmas. And when I mention Cinderella to people, usually this will come up as one of the versions they remember. But actual cosplays of it,
Yeah.
you're right. I struggle to think of anyone that's done any outfits from this film.
I'm
Hmm.
also happy to give you one of my other first fun facts for this episode,
Ooh.
which
Oh, go
is
ahead.
the ending song, There's Music in You, that the
Mm.
fairy godmother sings, is not originally part of Cinderella. It is part of another Rodgers and Hammerstein musical that was like lost to time. And they could not figure out a finale song for Whitney to sing. So There's Music in You is actually not in Broadway productions of this show, generally
Ooh.
speaking. This was done specifically for this telecast too. It's not in the Leslie Ann Warren, it's not in the Julie Andrews version. It's literally just in this version, and maybe now it's I can't remember if they played it. I don't think they played it in the Broadway touring company that I saw of Cinderella. Um, but it didn't originally belong in this film, but once they found it, it was obviously the right fit. So
Ooh, now you see that is indeed an interesting fact, and it shows that this version of the tale has some interesting little bits of identity of its own, which
yeah,
is it's so incredibly important with any retelling of something that everyone knows that there's something to latch onto to be memorable.
Uh,
Um,
that does include the other two songs in this version
ooh,
that do not exist in other versions of Cinderella. Falling in
ooh,
Love with Love is one of them. One of the
mm,
actually from the Boys from Syracuse is where Falling in Love with Love comes from. And it was the other part of the reason Bernadette Peters was cast as the stepmom. And The Sweetest Sounds, which is the song where the prince and Cinderella meet at the town square in the beginning is a
mm.
song called No is from No Strings. So the sweetest sounds did not exist in any other version of this except for this telecast. So
Ooh, interesting. I
although
mean,
I
mm,
Although I will say for opening songs, I do tend to prefer Who Am I, which is the Prince version of My Own Little Corner
mm.
that I heard in the Broadway touring company. But The Sweetest Sounds is pretty good. I do think I prefer Who Am I, but The Sweetest Sounds works in context of the telecast. So
Mm, mm. And speaking about the prince, I like the fact that he is an actual person
Yes.
here. And it's definitely something you've noticed in modern Cinderella retellings that they tried to give the prince a more rounded character to various degrees of success.
I think this prince, Paulo Montalban, who, by the way, this was his first big role. The only thing he'd done before
Mm.
this was he'd been an understudy of The King and I at the time he had done the audition for this.
Ah.
I think really this prince set off a tradition that we see then in Ever After a Cinderella story, where the prince is more realized.
Mm.
And then in the Richard Madden Cinderella in 2015, which I have some feelings about to
Mm.
discuss as a point. And I would argue the Cinderella in the Hilary Duff Cinderella movie is slightly actualized, as actualized as they can make a character in high school. Um, and I so Paula Montalban, they were looking for someone to match not the naivete of Cinderella, but they were looking for someone that was also looking for something. They wanted
Mm.
this prince to want something other than to just not be married. And he was like the last person they had at auditions.
Okay.
A whole bunch of people, including like Wayne Brady and Taye Diggs, had both auditioned for this role, and no one had felt right until they got to the very end of the last day and they got Paulo Montalban in. And as a newcomer, he works really well in this. I can see why his career took off kind of after this, but he's also honored this role because when they did Pop Roger and Hammerstein a couple years ago. He did 10 minutes ago as like a pop song a couple years back. And he still sounds great. He still looks great. Good for him. He was an amazing cast as Prince Christopher show.
Hmm. And he in the role he portrays, yeah, he feels like he's looking for something. He feels quite a very gentle masculinity. He's not pompous or like overbearing. To be honest, though, I mean, if you're going to play Prince Charming has never come across as a bombastic figure in
No, his father, his
personality.
father is always, or his mother in this case. They made Queen Constantina the
Yes.
bombastic one. Interestingly
Hmm.
enough, on the Wikipedia page, they use the word democratized to describe the prince. So
Hmm.
part of this,
Interesting.
the idea of him basically being a Princess Jasmine type, where she kind of wants to get out of the castle
Hmm.
and kind of wants to meet people and have adventures. So this is the first time with the prince we really see this kind of democratized prince that's going out to
Hmm.
meet the people. I think this also makes Lionel, Jason Alexander's character, stronger because it gives him motivation to be a worrywart. Lionel in the stage show really doesn't have much of a role other than to sing "The Prince is Giving a Ball," essentially. So in the movie here, you've expanded it not just for Jason Alexander, but you've actually given the prince's valet something to do, covering for the prince, understanding his motives. There's something really nice about kind of
Hmm.
expanding the interior life of a very small character and having it work and having it not just be a showpiece.
Hmm. Indeed, and it kind of shows it brings forth them across as two people as equals rather than the more traditional tellings of Cinderella as someone that's r- like getting their wish to become more than they are and sort of almost like the prince extending his hand to raise her up out of you know her commonhood sort of thing.
Yeah.
But here there are two people that clearly have a connection with each other. Um, and I that's what you've definitely seen within the more recent retellings, like of Cinderella and her prince being more equals with each other.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I think I'm sorry, go ahead, finish your thought.
Oh, just my one thought was, I think the only time I remember the prince actually showing his royal authority in this film is towards the end when he gets authoritarian with the stepmother. But other than that, he doesn't, yeah, he never really uses his power. because he doesn't he's not the sort of person that feels the need to sort of use that power willy-nilly.
Yeah,
And
and he's very young. Paul
mm,
Montalban wasn't just young when he got the role, but he and Brandy both play them as relatively young. There's
yeah.
a great moment in the film where where Whitney Houston shows up and it's the kitchen and
Mm.
um, Cinderella's just had her great torch song, the first version of "In My Own Little Corner," and she's like, "You can get me out of here," and the fairy godmother's like, "No, you have to get yourself out of here." Um, but I can, show you you can free yourself. It was part of the dialogue of this film is the idea of how they self-actualize Cinderella, and every Cinderella after this has been self-actualized. Every prince has gone through that, but this was the first time it really happened. It didn't happen in the Julie
Mm.
Andrews or the Leslie Ann Worland telecasts, and there were reviewers that hated that aspect of it. They thought it didn't go far enough. They thought it wasn't feminist enough, but there's only so much you can do with this material before, like, it's not the Hunger Games. It's one of those things where, like, there was so much thought into how to self-actualize both the prince and Cinderella, so they weren't just miming the 1950s. By the way, Disney seems to think they own the Cinderella brand. Disney Cinderella has its own Wikipedia page, like they were the first person to come up with the idea and the first person to adapt it. And I gotta tell you, this version of Cinderella is not as much Disney as it is Rodgers and Hammerstein, because not just the people that made the Broadway production coming in here, but even Whitney Houston was like, "I'm not going to do my normal R&B gospel vocal stylings," which she did because it's Whitney Houston. But she's like, "No, I'm going to do this almost as intended. We're going to update it and modernize it." But like, this was Disney facilitated this, but this really, except for the fact that it ran on ABC to relaunch Wonderful World of Disney, this is a Rodgers and Hammerstein Cinderella production. And Disney can't take credit for Rodgers and Hammerstein and stuff like that.
Mm.
So
Yep.
I just feel like that's something that people need to keep in mind about this is it doesn't just work because it's a colorful cast and a great set with lots of heart. It's also the intention of Roger and Hammerstein's Cinderella is one where you can always feel its growth. Like they had to get the people from the Roger and Hammerstein estates to sign off, and I think it was
Oh.
especially Mary Rodgers, if I got the name right, who was like, yeah, they really wanted this to be updated. Like she was really into it. There were just a couple of moments where she was like, I'm not sure about that. Um, but the estates were really into this and into the modernization, which is something Disney is always a little gun shy about modernizing things. It always
Mm.
feels like they really want it. Once it's a success, they don't want to mess with it. Um, which is why the failure of the Beauty and the Beast remake, I have a
Mm.
lot of thoughts about. So, uh, but that's another thing completely.
Oh yes. We could go off into a whole other territory if we started discussing the remake saga of the moment. Oh, no. I agree. It's a good thing that this has a clear identity of its own. And to be fair, there have been other studios that have tried to take popular um stories that people know of and do their own adaptations. There was one a while back, an adaptation of The Little Mermaid. It starred the actor, I think his name is William Morsley, from the Narnian films. Um, so they tried to do this Little Mermaid adaptation. She was in a circus fair for some bizarre reason. Um, However, whenever you say Little Mermaid, it always necessarily goes back to the Disney versions, that to the extent where the Cinderella Disney, as great as it is, it has kind of codified what the themes are that
Yeah,
people know about within Cinderella. And then you go back and you show them like a book or a play and such, and then they get confused as to like, oh, why is this? different. That because they're not aware of the fact of you know, that Disney Cinderella literally is just an adaptation like any other adaptation. It's just the most popular one they know of.
Yeah, and Disney has always been really good at branding. I mean, generally speaking, they've
Yes.
had some missteps. Currently, right now, in the parks especially, there's been some missteps with how they do branding.
Mm.
But if you think of something like the Haunted Mansion, which is basically just a haunted house ride with a bit of personality,
Mm.
they figured out really well how to market the Haunted Mansion. And they've been doing it since essentially the first video games came out because there's this really great Keys to the Kingdom Disneyland video game where you have a whole haunted mansion level. It's side scroller, but it's really great and effective. So Disney knows how to brand for better or worse. I
Mm.
will say again, like with '97 Cinderella, 1989's Little Mermaid only works because of Ashman's and Menken's music, and especially Howard Ashman's push into who Ariel would become and in all the music that he himself pushed them into. Like that Little Mermaid would not have been successful because in '84, when they were doing Splash with Daryl Hannah, um, they were they were basically I don't know if they were going to make a beat for beat remake of Splash for Little Mermaid, but Little Mermaid was going to be blonde. Eric was going to be more Tom Hanksian probably. It's just like Disney is both somehow incredibly creative, but also really gun shy about creativity unless they know it's going to make them a ton of money. It's this very
Mm.
weird place to be in, and sometimes you get '97 Cinderella, sometimes you get Drew Carey and Geppetto with Julia Louise Dreyfus as the Blue Fairy, and it doesn't work. And it's a very
Mm.
uneven thing, unfortunately, which is why Disney goes through eras, quote unquote. It's a
Mm.
whole thing for the company. It's part of the brand essentially. What's interesting about '97
Mm.
Cinderella is the only
Mm.
thing about it that has not come out that people have been clamoring for since it started. People have been clamoring for a cast album for this film for years, but unfortunately, the Houston and Brandy kind of musical producer estates could never come to an agreement, and it was one of the few
Ooh.
things Whitney Houston regretted before she passed away is that
Ooh.
this had never been made into a proper album. So
Oh
there's no
wow.
album for this. That's the only real problem with this
I
film
did
is
not know
there's no
that.
cast album.
Good God, I did not know this. That feels such a glaring gap. But
Yeah, and Houston tried rectifying it, I think, until she passed away. And I don't know why exactly it's still an issue, but it's one of the like getting it on Disney Plus was kind of a coup. And there's never really been any talks about how to release it, but there's no cast album for this. If you don't have the movie or VHS or Disney Plus, you don't really have a way. You can find it on parts of it on YouTube, and you can find the songs on YouTube, but they're
mm,
like rips from the movie. There's no cast album of this, so
wow. Huh. Well, hopefully one day that'll be rectified, because there's surely a lot of theatre buffs that would love to have an album of this music.
I mean, yeah, this is a really great theater show. Not
Mm.
just because of the casting. Bernadette Peters and Vienna Cox were both
Mm.
coming from the Sondheim traditions. In fact, Bernadette Peters as the witch in Into the Woods is why she was cast as the stepmother, because all the
Mm.
actresses they talked were like, I don't want to be wicked white stepmom to African American stepdaughter. But Bernadette was talked into it, and when you watch like old documentaries of this, like the promo they did for this, she's doing like the most not impassionate, but like the most I'm reading a script I've ever heard Bernadette Peters do. Um, but she had a lot of fun. Falling in Love with Love, which was brought into the show specifically for her to have something to sing because the stepmother really doesn't sing outside of Falling in Love with Love.
Mm.
Um, that was made so it could show that she was more bitter and less tyrannical. So she's really different from Lady Tremaine, both in Once Upon a Time and in the 1950s Cinderella Disney film, because she's not just kind of this harpy character, and she's not just this abusive person. And you see a little bit of that with Kate Blanchett, and Angelica Houston's versions in Ever
Mm,
After and the 2015 Cinderella. But specifically, Falling in Love with Love works really well, both to give a little bit of comedic relief, but also to really showcase part of why the stepmother is the quote unquote evil stepmother she is. In fact, in the cast list in the Cinderella on the wiki, she's only
mm,
called stepmother. She's not called an evil stepmother, which I think is an interesting thing to do, to not consider her quote unquote evil, when even the stepmom in the uh, Philippa Gregory or Gregory Maguire, one of the Gregorys, the one that did all the like updated fairy tale books, like the other
mm,
Boleyn girl, um, they even have kind of that evil stepmother trope as a big part of the story. And
mm,
here it's just like she's really bitter, but she doesn't like she does lock Cinderella in the kitchen when the prince appears, but it's not like aforementioned I'm going to throw away this key. It's like a moment of panic. It's less
mm.
conniving than both Kate Blanchett and Lady Tremaine's version are. I can't remember if Angelica
Yeah.
Houston locks her in a tower or not, but there's something more mild about this version of the stepmom. And I think it works both in context of this film and in context
Mm.
of Cinderella as a mythology on the whole, because we don't really need evil stepmom anymore. The world's hard enough for Cinderella. Evil stepmom is just not,
Yes.
you know, Kate Blanchett does have some bad moments in the 2015 Cinderella as a stepmom, but we get to see why she's like that too. So she has her own falling in
Yeah.
love with love moment essentially. Um,
Mm.
yeah,
No, I completely agree. The Kate Blanchett version of the character was decidedly more manipulative and, dare I say, cruel in many ways, because she actively, towards the end of the movie, was trying to sabotage Cinderella's attempts for happiness. And I mean, she wanted um, Cinder Cinderella to agree to be with the prince as long as she Cinderella herself manipulated the prince to get what the stepmother wanted. Whereas in this version, um, she's still sort of like self-centered, but you couldn't imagine her being that cruel. And I think it would have changed the tone of the movie if they had done so. I'm trying to remember if the original story for Cinderella described the stepmother as evil or just described her as like not a nice stepmother. Did it ever say she was evil in the original
I think
stories?
I think it's the idea of that Cinderella needs to have an adult in the building, and they need a reason to keep Cinderella kind of in the
Mm,
home and to keep her down. And so it's really
yes.
easy to have an evil stepmom character to fill that. But I haven't
Yeah.
read, like I did a Beauty and the Beast thesis. I didn't do a Cinderella thesis, so I can't say. One of the other things I really like about 97 Cinderella in regards to stepmother is that Calliope and Minerva, the stepsisters, um, aren't just irredeemable, kind of like they are in the 50s Cinderella animated film.
Mm,
Uh, to this day, infamously, that is the scene of them ripping Cinderella's dress in the 50s animated film is a scene that's so visceral for me that I have to literally skip that part of the film.
oh,
And so here they aren't exact like they are not exactly they are main cast because they're in all of the cast promotional material with the rest of the cast, but they feel more like the king and queen, where they're part of the story, but it's not really their story. The Disney Cinderella mythology got better about this when they started doing the direct-to-video Disney sequels. Then they started building from the Broadway show, where like Anastasia has a subplot where she's falling in love with the town baker, which is directly lifted from the Broadway show, by the way.
ooh,
But Calliope and Minerva here are two really great Broadway actresses who understand. both the humor in the part and how immature they are. They play it more as like an
Mm,
immature mean girl type. And it's really egged on by their mom and it works. And it's just toxic enough to be bad, but it's not so toxic that you can't imagine how, how Brandy has hung in there as long as she has. Um, I really like Calliope Minerva, and I think Stepsister's Lament is probably one of the best female duo Broadway songs.
mm.
Stepsister's Lament is really a tune for all of us that are altos that will not be playing Cinderella anytime soon because we're just not quote unquote right for the role. Um, when I saw Stepsister's Lament on stage, they actually had all of the women that had been trying to dance with the prince do this song on a staircase all together. She was like a choral of female voices dissing the idea of Cinderella and how perfect she was. So it wasn't just two. Um, and Stepsister's Lament really goes nicely because after Stepsister's Lament, you get Do I Love You Because You're Beautiful, but then you get Falling in Love with Love as well. Um,
Mm,
and I think it's a really nice section of songs. There's something about the progression of music in this show specifically, in this telecast specifically, that works really well. And Stepsister's Lament as kind of the middle of it because 10 minutes ago has happened, and then they got that 10 minutes of them showing off the dancers, and then you get Stepsister's Lament as essentially the
mm,
start of the second act. And I think it works really well. Um, because it goes from being very sappy to being a little silly and comedic almost immediately. So you don't have to you don't have to dwell too much on the romance if that's not really what you're here for. So
mm. Oh yeah, it's definitely one of the more memorable scenes in the movie when you see them sort of like stalking slash peeking through the
they're
bushes and
eavesdropping.
like
They're totally
yeah.
eavesdropping. And it worked really well because that's also what Bernadette Peters and Whoopi Goldberg have been trying to do the entire night, and it's the other two, the two stepsisters,
Yeah.
that actually are able to do the thing that the two moms can't do. So it's
Mm,
almost like by virtue of their youth and their immaturity, they're actually able to see kind of this young love bloom. And because we got to know Cinderella and Christopher as people as much as
yeah.
titles,
Mm,
you really do feel like, yes, it's a young love, but it makes more sense than the 50s Cinderella where they had never seen each other before that night. So,
and it does kind of match their childishness that they're doing that in the sense of it's more you'd imagine a jealous sibling would do that, like be lurking in the bushes watching what's going on with their sister or brother as they're going on a date, rather than more the parents and such. So it does kind of actually match into that theming of jealous sisterhood, um, watching after them, and it totally matches them as characters in the same vein of the stepmother like being bad but not necessarily evil. The stepsisters are just childishly immature rather than being wicked.
yeah.
And the comedy they bring with their performances again kind of like really works well in those roles. I mean, if they were more spiteful, it wouldn't be as enjoyable.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where, like, in Stepsisters Laments, their gripes are not unfounded. The idea of perfection
Mm,
in a woman, the idea of what it means to be married in that time period, and struggling with to accept yourself, even though we don't get that as much because in the Broadway show they have more time to especially focus on Anastasia falling in love with someone that is below her station and her mom is keeping her from seeing essentially. Calliope and Minerva they're a little malevolent in the beginning, but that's also just kind of how they've been taught to be. They don't know how to be other
mm,
things. This isn't a show about nuance, and I think if people are looking to critique it, because people love to critique the idea it had been pushed enough, they love to critique the idea that, you know, Brandy is the first African American Cinderella. One isn't
mm,
the first because there was Cindy, which is a version of Cinderella that was made specifically with an African American cast. But like, this is not a musical about subtlety. If you want subtlety, watch falsettos or something. Cinderella's not here to do that work. It's one of those things where like
Yeah.
people that dislike the stepsisters, specifically in this, for either being too funny or not being mature or self-actualized enough. Well, hindsight is 2020 for one. For two, that's just not the show. I mean,
No.
they're specifically different in Into the Woods, because Into the Woods, though there's strokes of the Cinderella story, it's doing completely different work. It's like when
Mm,
people compare Wicked, the Broadway musical, to Wicked the book. They're both very different from Wizard of Oz, and they're very different
mm.
from each other, even though they borrow locations and things. So it's
Yeah.
like this version of Cinderella, though it's not about them, though it's really not about the king and queen, they all kind of get their moments. And
Yeah.
Victor Garber himself, having played a starring role in both originating Jesus and Godspell and playing Jesus in the Godspell film, um, gives a really great, subtle performance here as kind of the loving yet henpecked husband. And it was great that he didn't take the air out of the room, that he let Whoopi do what Whoopi does best, but he was also there conspiring with his son, conspiring with Lionel. You really still felt his presence in the room. Nobody in this
Mm,
main cast list felt like they weren't doing something in this
mm.
film. I'm also just a big fan of Victor Garber, so I'm really glad they cast him as King Maximilian. I can imagine someone else taking the role and either going like too hard or just disappearing into the woodwork.
Mm,
And so I appreciate the active. So it's not colorblind casting, by the way. They were very aware of color when they cast. They just
yes.
chose to be as diverse as possible. There was a term for it, but I can't find it. But when people say this is quote unquote colorblind casting, it's not. And they
Mm,
specifically talk in the casting process about how it was not colorblind, but
mm,
that like they were seeing color when they cast. Like they were going for the diversity of it. Like they didn't know they were going to find a Filipino actor to play the prince, but they were not just going to have it be Black Cinderella, everybody else is white. Like that's not what this was. So
mm. There was something quite beautiful about the fact it was so not stated. Like, in a way, they because they nothing was really made of it. You're watching the actors and as the actors and watching them play the roles and such. Like, they're clearly be representing, but they're not having to state it. And that is just there's something perfect about that. It's really enjoyable. Um,
Victor
whereas
would
now,
agree with you. When people ask Victor Garber about it, he's like, "No, it's extraordinary, and we should do it more often." So Victor
yeah.
Garber agrees with you at that point.
Well, I feel honored to have his agreement with me. It, I mean, you've got clear representation these days, but they have to go out of their way to state that, about the representation, and it just, uh, I don't know.
Yeah, I do like that the internet kind of picks up on the like massive representation boost in this film. About
Mm.
every decade or so, like the meme about how black mom and a white dad had an Asian kid, and it was like no big deal in '97. So why is it a big deal now? I love that that comes up every now and then, but that was part of the casting in that they knew they were doing something pushing the boat out, and so they just decided to push it out fully. And I think the biggest to do about casting after Whitney decided she didn't want to play Cinderella was that they were so thoughtful about casting Bernadette Peters as a stepmom, so thoughtful about the idea of an African American daughter and a white mom. And like, even though they don't acknowledge that kind of racial makeup, they were very, very adamant about not showing like Bernadette Peters as this isn't like 20 years of Cinderella. It's not that kind of film. If anything, Kate Blanchett as stepmom is way worse to Lily James than Bernadette is to Brandy in this film.
Oh yeah.
Angelica
Oh yeah.
Houston to Drew Barrymore is way worse.
Hmm.
And they were so aware of it, and they cast Bernadette because she brought comedy to the stepmother, who doesn't really have it in other versions of this. If you see a stage version, a touring stage version, the stepmom is really only a catalyst as an obstacle. She's not really she's a full character because she's there and she takes up air. But when I think about characters in Cinderella, I always struggle with remembering what stepmom looks like. And I don't struggle with remembering what Bernadette Peters looks like. And it's such good casting, and it's such good casting of having Brandy as Cinderella. And Brandy, of course, had been doing Moesha, and Brandy had a recording career, but this was kind of the first big role for her, and she felt the weight of it, and she was very nervous about it, but
Mm.
she was very honest about that nervousness. And Whitney came in as a literal godmother, both fairy and otherwise, and really pushed this project forward. And like Brandy still talks about how much this project meant to her, and it feels
Mm.
very authentic. And you can feel that authenticity both on screen and off screen, even all these years later. So,
Might this be a good time then to come up with a point of the return of Brandy as Cinderella?
is she? I mean, at the age she's at the age where I think she would probably transition into being the godmother again. I do think. I think also, although I will say this Cinderella is slightly more alto, lower soprano, so she could probably still hit those notes. But I would see her more as the queen or fairy godmother role, unless she's explicitly said she wants to be Cinderella again. I'm not going.
Um, oh, mm, I'm not going to spoil anything for you if I talk about Descendants, will I?
No, because I know she had done some stuff with Todrick Hall, like they had done some reworkings of these particular versions. So these songs
Yeah.
also sound different than other version of Cinderella because the arrangements are different. They're still in the vein of what Rodgers and Hammerstein's intended, but this particular telecast in '97, they updated the arrangements so they're more pop, slightly more R&B, a little more rhythmic than they were necessarily on stage. And so I know that she then took what we have in '97 and updated it with Todrick Hall. But I don't watch Descendants, so like I'm not
Mm.
gonna miss anything if you're not spoiling things for me.
Excellent. With okay, that's great. With knowing that out of the way, to give you a little bit of information, Descendants is officially coming back. I think it might be later this year. They've got a new movie, a live action one coming out. It's continuing in the same universe as the original trilogy, but it's officially a new kind of cast. It's
Okay.
going to be doing an Alice in Wonderland thing, and it's going to be called The Pocket Watch. They have confirmed that Brandy as Cinderella will be reprising her role in this movie.
Oh, that's nice. I like that.
She
I
is
mean, you
officially
could
coming
have
back.
you made they made Cheyenne Jackson a very believable Hades, which I never thought would happen. So I'm not going to tell them they can do anything the heck they want to do, to be perfectly honest. Like they made uh I
Mhm.
never thought I would see Cheyenne Jackson with Mohawk after I saw him in Xanadu in short shorts. So like yeah, for people that love the Descendant and the Zombies films, I'm happy for you. I've just aged out of that a little bit myself. It's just a little bit too. That's why I was so surprised. The School of Magic, which was a Netflix film that I didn't like. I didn't X out of it in time, so it started playing, and I was like, oh well, I'm here. I'm gonna watch it. Or it's School of Good and Evil, something
School of
similar.
Good and Evil.
Yeah. So School of Good and Evil, I did not think I was going to like. Uh, but it's one of those things where it's an updated version of the fairy tale iconography. And much like
Mm,
'97 Cinderella, it's not quite pastiche. It's still kind of in its own little pocket universe of time and space. But
mm,
like the mixing of it is so good and interesting in what they have to say. I
mm.
think it would actually be a really great pairing with 97 Cinderella, although you'll have to change the streaming services after you're done with one, because 97 Cinderella is only available on Disney Plus. But
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
School of Good and Evil was really interesting. It's the idea of a princess and what she is and what she means and how she becomes who she is. What is good, which is something Cinderella has always grappled with a little bit. You see it again
Mm,
more in the stage version, especially with like updated rewrites like what I saw. Where they
mm,
have like literally a book that either teaches you to insult people or be really cool with people, depending upon who's reading it. It's a whole thing. Um, there's something I like about 97 Cinderella, and that Cinderella has this like great patient goodness, but you also do get the feeling the idea that she doesn't really know how to leave. Not that
mm,
stepmom and stepsisters aren't great. They're obviously not giving her like the love and admiration she obviously deserves, but you do get the same feeling, and this might just be because I'm part of that later Shaun of the Dead generation, that sometimes you do just get stuck and you can't see the forest for the trees.
mm,
And I think especially in this version of Cinderella, I get that specifically. So
mm. Her song, My Own Little Corner, like some of the lyrics in that are just perfect at describing
yeah.
Cinderella's personality. I'm as mild and as meek as a mouse.
I
And sorry,
I
go on.
I do wish they would put the reprise. I do wish they'd done the because there is a reprise to In
Mm,
My Own Little Corner
mm,
in the stage show that I think is really powerful. Um, but in my own little corner, and if you listen to On the Steps of the Palace, you can see how
mm,
composers have kind of been grappling with the idea of how does Cinderella see herself. I think In My Own Little Corner is one of Brandy's better songs because it works so much with her vocal stylings and how she sings. The
mm.
songs in this TV film telecast are just on point. Uh, I don't think
Yeah.
there is a single song, even the sweetest sounds, which is maybe my least favorite song in the whole show, is not bad by any stretch. Do I Love You
Mm,
Because You're Beautiful is a great waltzing song, and it's a great song for like a wedding. I think
mm,
A Lovely Night, when you see A Lovely Night on stage, they have the actress that plays Calliope, who in this is Vienna Cox, does this really great brassy jazz alto, and she pretends to play a pianoforte, like a literal piano for this. And so there's an interactive element to A Lovely Night that you actually feel in this version of it because of how the camera works with them as they're dancing with each other. And there's this great moment where you see the kind of family they could have been.
mm,
And there's something so beautiful and bittersweet about that because it's so real. And this world is very fantasy and confectionery, but it doesn't feel unsubstantial. And especially in A Lovely
mm.
Night, you get that. And then, of course, you get There Is Music in You, and everybody's crying, and Whitney Houston is hitting all the high notes ever invented by man or God. And it's just it's so good. The Prince is Giving a Ball. That is the one song where it never changes between versions. I see The Prince is Giving a Ball. They always stop in Herman in the middle of it, and it's so good, and it's so gay, and it's so good.
Oh yeah, this movie is like it's so beautifully camp all over the place.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it's not overwhelmingly camp. Like the campness never feels forced or too much to enjoy. I think that's because they get the right balance of like, you know, the serious bits composed to the lovely humorous bits and such.
Yeah, I think
Um,
that there's a really great scene. Queen Constantina trying to barter with Prince Christopher to even have the ball, and Whitney Houston's voice is doing that, and it's just getting higher with each successive. She just wants so hard to have her
yeah.
son married, and but it's little. It's not so forced that you feel like Lionel still feels like he or Christopher still feels like he has agency in this film, even though it's obvious what his two parents, the ruling authorities of the land, want. I think it's part of the it's the idea that it's okay to have a fantasy film be a fantasy film. I think it's something we're
Mm.
uncomfortable with now. And I think you see a little bit of that in School of Good and Evil. I was surprised how much I enjoyed it, but like I feel like we've had trouble in film and TV telecasts being okay with what things are. I think about the
Mm.
idea in when they did the live action Peter Pan with Christopher Walken, they were unsure of how to approach the source material. So instead of double casting Jim Darling and Captain Hook like you're supposed to, because it's supposed to mean something, they broke that and it creates a totally different context. I feel like the live action version of The Wiz, where they actually go back to what the Broadway show was like and not the film, is as close to 97 Cinderella as we'd had in a long time. And I'm not just saying that because I love Mary J. Blige singing No Bad News. I'm not just saying that because Amber Riley saying he's the wizard. I think in 97 what this meant because it came out of the roots of Bette Midler's version of Gypsy. So Bette Midler's version of Gypsy and the success of that gave the green light to the people that were convincing Whitney Houston and convincing the TV stations to let them make this. Which, by the way, this had like a $20 million budget in 1997. It's still one of the most
Wow.
expensive TV telecasts ever made. Um, and I think it really is the reason that every now and then people try to bring back TV musical telecasts. We just have a different relationship in America with musicals. Like they both seem more special and so much farther away than maybe they seem on the West End and the UK. Like we don't really get musical theater,
Hmm.
movie nights at Christmas time. The last time we had that was Cats, and that caused a pandemic. So I don't know what I want to say about it. But like we have such a different relationship to musical theater here in America. It's a really intriguing thing to see about. But I like that 97 Cinderella is an ocean or is a bridge across the ocean of our differences.
No, no, you're right. Oh, I was just trying to think if there's any recent musical stuff that's come out on telly. Um, or on in the cinema. Oh, you're right. I think Freaking Cats was the last major one I can think of. Oh, I'll have to scrub my brain after this. Um,
I mean, because sometimes you get something like Ella Enchanted or 13 Going on 30, where they have musical moments, but music isn't really the center of it. The
no, no.
problem is
Yeah.
you still get the same issue we're talking about. So with 97 Cinderella, they leaned into the fantasy element. When you
Mm,
look at something like Les Mis or like Cats, there's a fantasy element to theater where if you're not comfortable with it and you go too far realistic, then the
mm,
absurdity of people singing their feelings, which is what theater is, really comes out.
yeah.
I will
Mm.
say there was Prom. Netflix did a version of the musical Prom, and they
Oh,
had Meryl
yeah.
Streep, and they had Andrew, whatever his name is, whose name I can never remember. So Prom happened, and Prom is okay, but Prom really feels like other musicals I've seen. Prom doesn't
Yeah.
feel, especially the finale song of Prom, really sounded like other things that I've heard. It doesn't really feel like its own thing. It's nothing to say. It's not a bad
No.
show. I'm glad it's an original concept based on a thing that sadly happened, but it's an original concept. So like it's just one of those things where
Mm.
people have such
Uh,
a so we get stylized things like Wednesday and the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina because that's I feel like that's as close to musical theater as people will allow themselves to come in the vein of fantasy. I think is
mm.
my thought on that.
I thought of another example, which actually probably is a really good contrast to what we're discussing. I would say a more recent musical I can think of is Amazon Cinderella, because I think that
Yeah.
came out in the last couple of years,
It
and
did,
that
but yeah, nobody saw it though, so it's fine.
I did,
Oh,
unfortunately.
you did? I'm sorry.
I know.
I can't give you
Um,
back those 2 hours of your life. I
but
saw the reviews and I was like, I already didn't want to see this. Now I really don't want to see it.
it so actually it's a I think this is a really great thing to from the points that I have, I think this might be a really good one to conclude on for this episode. So we were talked about Cinderella 97 being understated with its representation and just having fun and being not nice, light, and airy. Amazon Cinderella was all about representation, but it felt it had to throw it in your face. Like it had to go on about like the different backgrounds, certain characters and such. They were actively going out of their way to give Cinderella a different motivation to be at the ball beyond like wanting to go to the ball. In Amazon Cinderella, she went to the ball because she heard there was going to be clients there for her dressmaking business, and she was hoping to show off some of her garments to various rich people to see if she could secure a work contract.
Which is a choice. That's definitely updated.
Yeah,
Um and also I think 20 the Amazon Cinderella, they use a lot more pastiche. Like they use songs
yeah.
from other people's catalogs as opposed to like Cinderella type songs, if I remember correctly. It was like a
It's
big draw.
oh yeah, the Amazon Cinderella was all they were borrowing songs from different places that were popular and well known at the time, but it's that sort of stuff that dates a movie like crazy. There was no originality within the song work. Um, it was bad.
I
Sorry, my
wonder I
brain's
wonder
starting to shut
how it
down.
I wonder how it would compare, because there is a new onstage version of Romeo and Juliet where they use like Backstreet Boys songs. So I wonder how that would compare with like this new, because there's a new generation of Cinderella. There's Andrew Lloyd Webber's Bad Cinderella, which I've heard very bad things about, or nothing at all. And there's this Romeo and Juliet pastiche. It all kind of feels very Moulin Rouge in a way. Like it's the idea
Mm.
of using songs to tell a story, but it can't all be Jim Broadbent singing like a virgin. Like it can't all be that. That has to happen just once or twice. You get one or two of those. Um, I also think because we watch things differently than we did in 97. In 97, there was no streaming services. You had cable, or you had cable plus, or you had nothing. That was what it was. And
Mm.
now the idea of how do we get people to watch? So you do stunt casting because Camila Cabello has a serviceable voice, but she's not anywhere near where Brandy was in 97. And Brandy was actively worried about her ability to sing in Cinderella. She was vigilant about it and did a lot of work both with Whitney Houston and with with these specialized composers for this. Like there was a concerted effort, and I can't speak for Camila Cabello because I was not in the room, but there was a concerted effort, not just on Brandy's part, but on Whitney's part to make sure Brandy got there. And
Yeah.
Billy Porter can sing really well, but Billy Porter does not sing as the fairy godmother in that version. So there's no
Mm.
reason to take Camilla under his wing,
Mm.
essentially. So yeah, I think
I should.
97 Cinderella is wonderful and important, and I'm really glad for what it pushed forward. But it's not magic I think you can capture again, and it's not magic I think we should capture again. I'd be curious to see what Descendants will do with Brandy's Cinderella, and if they'll go full on. She's no longer married to the prince; she self-actualized out of the castle, sort of way, or if she's just. I'll be intrigued to see what they do with it.
Mm.
I think it'll work really well because Brandy has always in her projects been very thoughtful about what she did. There's nothing that Brandy's done where there wasn't thought behind it, because
Yeah.
it means so much to her. And I'm not saying Camilla's career doesn't mean a bunch to her. I'm sure it does, but it's just it comes from a different time and place. about
Yeah.
what a music career really meant and what you did with it. So
Mm.
yeah,
I I should stress with the Amazon Cinderella, I didn't feel a lot of the actors phoned it in with their performances. Um, I think they did try their best. I lay the feet solely at the fact of the writers and producers attempting to do a modern retelling of the story without grasping any sort of nuance in the actual telling, and then the actors were lumped with what they had to perform,
yeah.
shall we say?
And I
Um,
haven't seen it, so I'm not going to pass
yeah,
judgment. I will just say that if you
yeah,
want pastiche, but you want it in medieval time period, you
yeah.
want A Knight's Tale, because A Knight's
Mhm.
Tale and Ever After are the two movies that are going to get you there. Maybe Shakespeare in
So,
the Park if you're feeling zesty.
mm. So going back to the good Cinderella,
Yeah.
uh, my takeaway from Cinderella '97 is it, to my mind, it's the perfect version of a pantomime as a film. Now, it because of the fact that it focuses on being joyous, entertaining, which is, I think, being entertaining is often overlooked as a basic concept in some stuff when people are making something. Um, Brilliant performances, and just every element of it works perfectly together. Um, and like a panto, it's something that you can enjoy by yourself, but with the family as well. And it's a sort of film that you could just put on um with your family at Christmas time and just sit back and enjoy
Or
and be,
anytime.
yeah. Well,
It's
yeah,
kind of
any
it's kind
time
of like
really,
a
but
princess themed birthday party, especially. I think it's especially
oh,
good for something
true,
like that.
true.
Yeah.
That's true. It doesn't need to necessarily be Christmas time. It's just some that's just some strangeness I've got going on in my head.
Yeah. I I I think this is really important in our time, almost as much as it was important in 97, because we are at a place where
Mm,
we're rethinking how we look at what we watch. Because there's so many options now, you really do feel like you have to choose. Um, and kind of like I was talking about the idea of fantasy, like we get a lot of like dark fantasy now. We've got Chilling Adventures of Sabrina that came out. We have Wednesday, The Umbrella Academy. So in the context of fantasy, I feel like a lot of people now have fantasy wrapped up with superhero. But there's a version of
mm,
fantasy that really is this idea of a musical, this kind of heightened romance, this almost kind of Witches of Eastwick, Moonstruck, Beautician and the Beast sort of not weird romance, but there's like an art to how you showcase a fantasy romance that we haven't seen in a while, either because people don't think it's a thing we want anymore, or it's because there's a risk to it. Because there was a risk to 97 Cinderella. There was no telling if there was going to be reward. This was kicking off an anthology series for the Wonderful World of Disney for being a reboot. This was something that was such a passion product of all the people involved. If it had failed, it would have killed TV telecast film musicals for a long time.
mm.
And it's one of those things where, like, I don't think people understand when they say 23 million households tuned in to watch this the night it was broadcast, just how big an audience that was for the time. And the way it affected people's. I have one friend that has a sister that loved this movie so much he can no longer bear to watch it because it was on repeat at their house until they wore out the VHS tape. And
Oh
I
my
think it's
God.
one of those things people keep trying to recreate the sort of appointment television in a way that may no longer exist. And it's okay if we can't remake it because we still have this version of it. And
Mm.
it's timeless enough that it doesn't feel so stuck in a way that uh, the Amazon Cinderella may end up feeling stuck. It may not. I mean, the drawback of pastiche, the drawback of doing something like Moulin Rouge, is that eventually Nirvana's been around and ubiquitous for so long. Um, when you hear Nirvana against juxtaposed against 1900s call girls at the Moulin Rouge, it starts to feel really dated. And this is not
Mm.
a musical that feels dated. And the fact that this is its
Mm.
own special thing in Cinderella, in the universe of Cinderella, in the universe of Rodgers and Hammerstein Cinderella, um, the fact that it has new songs, it has updated songs, I think it's really special. And when we were thinking about musical theater month for March,
Mm.
I it's super important to talk about this because it's kind of the meeting of all of the different genres we love in film and TV and musical theater, all in one beautiful, weird confectionery sort of place, and I appreciate that.
Mm. Yeah, I think what you've just said is a perfect way to sum it up, sir.
I think so too, and not just because I'm an Aries. And so we are going to be continuing Musical Theater Month. We are going to be talking in next episode about the Buffy the Vampire Slayer musical episode once
Woo!
more with Feeling, which a lot of people really love, and which it's one of the few Buffy costumes I've ever wanted to do for cosplay. We'll talk about that. And then in April, because it's my birthday month, we're doing all kinds of stuff that I love. Me. It's all about me. Um,
It's all about you, girl,
It's
on your
all
very
about
special birthday.
very special birthday, my very special birthday month. In any case, I want to thank you all for tuning in to Everything is Gay, Even the Straight Stuff. Thank you, Magnus, for being my always luxurious, whimsical, fabulous co-host.
Mm. I have to bring even more fabulousness next time.
It's true.
But next time is Buffy, so maybe fabulousness is not the right way. More butt kicking is the best
Butt
way.
kicking, pointy sticks, and peroxide hair dye for all of you James Masters fans out there. We'll see you all next time on Everything is Gay, Even the Straight Stuff.
Bye.
Bye.